John Thelwall, radical, writer, orator, reformer, performer.
Fearless and eloquent champion of the rights of all men, women and children.
One of 18th century England's most feared men, a source of terror to the ruling classes.
Little known outside of dusty corners of academia, specialist societies and history books.
I first opened the pages of E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class on my 21st birthday, 1972. It seemed to sit quite easily along with the glass-bottomed pewter tankard, a traditional father son present back then. Key in the door and welcome up the local tune. The glass bottom, so I could see the Queen's shilling and escape and listen in some past imperial war. The tankard now holds paintbrushes in the shed, but the book sits on my shelf like a Bible. But it wasn't just the text that changed my life. It was the picture on the cover of the label, foregrounded in late summer contentment. Basket of blackberries, billycock hat, puffing billy locomotion, or some such, steaming and smoking along behind. Like many a sacred text, it is a product of its time. But in 2020, I returned to its pages. Church bells ringing in the garden. I was hot on the trail of John Thelwall, like some government spy checking the index to find initially this strange amalgam of 18th century Augustan and yet modern, self-reflexive, post-modernist text.
Eh?
Academics.
I don't know.
What happened then?
To continue. In 1794, Thelwall was arrested. And here follows the record of his Privy Council interrogation in the presence of no lesser personages than the Prime Minister William Pitt, the Home Secretary, and the Lord Chancellor, John Thelwall, the Jacobin Fox, the most dangerous man in England.
Just going to stop you there a moment, Stuart, as I think these people need a little bit of background as to who actually John Thelwall is.
How he got here, or who his family are. We need his backstory.
John Thelwall, born 27th of July 1764 in Covent Garden, the son of a silk merchant who sadly died when I was but 8 years old. When I was 13, I had to leave school to help my mother with the family business. I served an apprenticeship as a tailor and also tried to make a living as an attorney. But morally, that job wasn't right for me. So I used my writing skills to become a journalist and an editor. I also became interested in medicine and wrote a number of papers. In 1792, as some said, intoxicated by the French doctrines of the day, I held talks in London's radical societies and made acquaintance with John Horne Tooke, and we set up the London Corresponding Society. Then, in 1794, continue, sir, if you please.
What was it?
Oh, the most dangerous man in England, that Jacobin Fox. Oh, I like those titles.
Ah, yes, John Thelwall. That Jacobin Fox, the most dangerous man in England. Thelwall tells of his interrogation thus.
I was called in and beheld the whole dramatis personae, entrenched chin-deep in lectures and manuscripts, all scattered about in the utmost confusion.
He continues his account of this dramatic depiction. Here, the Attorney General. Here, William Pitt.
Mr. Thelwall, what is your Christian name?
John.
Your surname with 2 L's at the end or with 1?
With 2, but it doesn't signify. You need not give yourself any trouble. I do not intend to answer any of your questions.
What does he say? What?
He does not mean to answer any questions.
What is this? Who is this man?
John Thelwall then turned his back on the august company, and in the words of Citizen John,
I began to contemplate a drawing in watercolours.
the Prime Minister dismissed him and summoned for interrogation a 14-year-old lad by name of Henry Eaton, who had been living with the Thelwalls. A daunting interview for a 14-year-old child with the Prime Minister. But the brave boy stood his ground, and as the Morning Post, 16th of May, 1794 put it, entered into a political harangue in which he used very harsh language against Mr. Pitt, upbraiding him with having taxed the people to an enormous extent.
I harangue you, sir, for having taxed the people to an enormous extent.
It really doesn't bother me what you think, little boy.
There's a local connection here, by the way. For as Thompson points out, even though Thelwall and his colleagues at the London Corresponding Society were facing a possible bloody execution, prosecution, government and the accused mixed together in a strangely informal way back then. And just down the road, later when John Binns, the Jacobin, was imprisoned without trial in Gloucester Castle, facing execution, the Home Secretary, his wife, and 2 daughters paid him a social visit. But Thelwall had little time for such niceties.
Being asked by the clerk of the council how I spelt my name, I answered I might spell it according to his own discretion, for I would not answer his questions of any kind.
Whatever is what we might say today, and so Thelwall was one of a dozen sent to the Tower and then Newgate, with a possible sentence of hanging, then to be cut down from the gallows before death, followed by disemboweling, followed by burning of the entrails in front of the victim's face, followed by beheading and quartering. This was the sentence in the wings. And yet, with perfect complacency, despite his confinement in the charnel house, Citizen John composed a series of reflective lines, poems written in close confinement in the Tower and Newgate, where, fortified by the knowledge that he is doing right, he pens,
within the dungeon's noxious gloom, the patriot still with dauntless breast the cheerful aspect can assume, and smile in conscious virtue blessed.
His colleague from the London Corresponding Society, the shoemaker Thomas Hardy, was also in the dock, accused of the same crimes against the state. Unlike Thelwall, he has left scant record of his repeated Privy Council interrogations. But despite his acquittal, the family suffered dreadful repercussions. The Hardy household was attacked by a Church and King loyalist mob, and Mrs. Hardy died in childbirth as a consequence of the resultant shock. A grand jury of respectable citizens had no stomach for such a barbaric sentence on a charge of high treason, and after a 9-day trial, Hardy was acquitted with nice coincidence on Guy Fawkes Day 1794. The foreman of the jury fainted after delivering his not guilty, while the London crowd went wild with enthusiasm and dragged Hardy in triumph through the streets. Acquittals for Hornchurch and Thelwall and the dismissal of other cases followed. Citizen John's twice weekly lectures followed, as he described in a typically Thelwallian letter to Mrs. Thelwall.
2 nights I have had nearly 600 persons. 2 nights in particular have shaken the pillars of corruption, till every stone of the rotten edifice trembled. Every sentence darted from breast to breast with electric contagion, and the very aristocrats themselves, numbers of whom thronged to hear me, were frequently compelled to join in the acclamations.
But he also spoke of the poor and oppressed, of course. Listen to this picture of Spitalfields and the silk industry.
Even in my short remembrance, barefoot, ragged children were very rare. Now, you will find the poor weavers and their families crowded together into vile, filthy, and unwholesome chambers, destitute of the most common comforts and even of the most common necessities of life.
The late autumn of 1795 saw Citizen John's charismatic command of rhetoric in action again at Copenhagen Fields, Islington, this time using his voice rather than pen to inspire and enthuse a mass meeting of 100,000 people.
The whole nation should be unified, combined in one grand political association or corresponding society, from the Orkneys to the Thames, from the cliffs of Dover to Land's End.
And the king was addressed through a remonstrance.
Wherefore, in the midst of apparent plenty, are we thus compelled to starve? Why, when we incessantly toil and labour, must we pine in misery and want? Parliamentary corruption, like a foaming whirlpool, swallows the fruit of our labours.
Citizen John was at pains to keep matters peaceful, but he was singled out after subsequent riots of 200,000 in the streets of London.
Down with Pitt, no war, no king. 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 200,000 people. Why, that's
25% of the people living in the city.
Down with Pitt, no war, no king.
Alas, the Seditious Meetings Act and the Gagging Act followed.
Kill these bills. Kill these bills. Kill these bills.
There was a particular and pointed clause allowing the closure of lecture rooms if deemed disorderly houses. This was aimed directly at John Thelwall. The lecture rooms were closed and silent. His newspaper, the Tribune, was closed down and silent. The Jacobin Fox tried to evade the hunt and the attempted silence of his pen by using ancient Rome as a political allegory, rather than writing directly about England in the here and now. But further persecution followed. Citizen John was assaulted by armed sailors when on a lecturing tour in East Anglia. He gave over 20 lectures in radical Norwich. But alas, in Yarmouth, he and his audience were ferociously attacked by nearly 100 sailors, armed with cutlasses and cudgels, landing from the naval frigate, conveniently and coincidentally at anchor in the harbour. Just in case these mariners were insufficient in number, Citizen John and his audience also faced the wrath of armed associates and dragoons. But let us not forget the strength of his words.
Ancient abuses are not by their antiquity converted into virtues. Man has rights which no statutes or usages can take away. Thought ought to be free. Intellectual beings are entitled to the use of their intellects. That one order of society has no right, however many years soever they have been guilty of the pillage, to plunder and oppress the other parts of the community. These are the principles that I admire, and that cause me, notwithstanding all its excesses, to exult in the French Revolution.
In 1795 and 96, this required the utmost courage, as did Thelwall's equation of Robespierre with William Pitt. Even after the Reign of Terror, and then with Robespierre's death, which was construed as a direct threat that the same fate would befall William Pitt. Or
Pitt has neglected, and by his wars and consequent taxes oppressed the poor to secure his popularity amongst the rich.
Citizen John singled out. For from his quondam lecturing base at both the buildings in the Stroud, and from the pages of Tribune, his lectures fused together the oral and the textual, the page and the stage. But he could assert, in the rights of nature, that there was more to changing society than just the politics of Tom Paine's Rights of Man.
I affirm that every man and every woman and every child ought to obtain something more in the general distribution of the fruits of labour than food and rags and a wretched hammock with a poor rug to cover it, and that without working 12 or 14 hours a day from the age of 6 to 60, they have a claim, a sacred and inviolable claim, to some comfort and enjoyment, to some tolerable leisure for such discussions, and some means of, or such information as may lead to an understanding of their rights.
But further persecution and that blind eye, turned by justices of the peace to attacks by those sailors, those armed associates and dragoons, combined to create a well-justified and growing paranoia about spies and informants in coffee house or tavern.
Some strange but well-dressed man would seat himself on the opposite side of my box.
And in an oyster house or beef shop,
I would conceit that one half of the boxes in the room have government spies in them.
all of this helped lead to Samuel Taylor Coleridge to consider a visit from Thelwall.
It was 1797 that I settled upon Nether Stowey to perhaps further my writings and finally instill within myself some creativity that would be not only worthy but profitable. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan his sacred pleasure domes decree, where out the sacred river ran through caverns measureless for man, down to the sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery.
Such is the countryside around Nether Stowey, unfolding sunny spots of greenery and lawn, no doubt. And so Coleridge accepted a visit from
The intrepid, eloquent and honest
John Thelwall to his home in Nether Stowey in the summer of 1797. Thelwall wandered to Somerset, walking across the wilds of Salisbury Plain. Coleridge wrote the following to a friend that year.
If the day of darkness and tempest should come, it is most probable that the influence of Thelwall will be great on the lower classes.
But Thelwall was now dreaming of escape and respite.
It would be sweet, with kindly interchange of mutual aid, to delve our little garden plots the while. Sweet converse flowed, suspending off the arm and half-driven spade, while eager one propounds and listens one, weighing each pregnant word and pondering fit reply.
But spies were hotfoot to Nether Stowey too, following that
Little stout man with his dark crop of hair and his white hat.
And so John Thelwall wrote thus.
Ah, let me then, far from stressful scenes of public life, let me far in some sequestered dell, build my low cot, most happy might it prove. My dear Samuel, near to thine, that I might oft share thy sweet concourse, best beloved of friends.
Coleridge, feeling the hot breath of spies, wrote thus.
Actually, at present, I can see that much evil and little good would result from you settling here.
The Wordsworth William and his sister Dorothy lived nearby and often visited.
It is often difficult to be known just as sister, especially when I am so much more. Dorothy Wordsworth, author, poet, diarist, lifelong companion to William. I should detest the idea of setting myself up as an author. Give William the pleasure of it. We lived close by Mr. Coleridge, and he has dined with us on many occasions. I remember once he brought his ballad finished, the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. We walked with him to the miner's house. It was a beautiful evening, very starry with the haunted moon. And upon some occasions there were no literary work, but rather Mr. Thelwall. But all my life I have composed in diaries. But that is a separate story and a different play. William is a far better poet and orator on political matters.
What as for William Wordsworth, he no longer found it.
Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven.
His views on the French Revolution had shifted.
All was quieted by iron bonds of military sway. The swifting aims, the varied functions and high attributes of civil action yielded to a power formal and odious and contemptible.
Coleridge, however, had not yet reached a position of total retirement from political discourse. On a summer's day in 1797, he and Thelwall wandered the Quantons to rest a while
in a beautiful, secluded down,
where this interchange was recollected.
Ah, Citizen John, this is a fine place to talk treason in.
Nay, Citizen Samuel, 'tis rather a place to make a man forget that there is any necessity for treason.
It would be another 2 years before Coleridge wrote the following to Wordsworth.
I wish you would write a poem in blank verse addressed to those who, in consequence of the complete failure of the French Revolution, have thrown up all hopes of the amelioration of mankind and are sinking into an almost Epicurean selfishness, disguising the same under the soft titles of domestic attachment and contempt for visionary philosophe.
But Thelwall was sent on his way, and so he came to Stroud in the summer of 1797, the year of the naval mutinies, the so-called floating republic. He stayed with 3 clothings in Nailsworth, Chalford and Bowbridge, by names of Partridge, Norton and Newton. They must have been radical supporters of the radical London Corresponding Society, and they offered succour to Thelwall. This is how he survived and thrived between his political exile in 1797 and his return to London in 1806 and long afterwards. He found allies amongst the intelligent, activist, artisan, working and middle class in pretty much every mill, market and industrial town throughout the country.
On leaving the bottoms of Gloucestershire, where the author has been entertained by several families with great hospitality, August the 12th, 1797. Regions of hospitality, dear scenes where I have loitered cheerily and quaffed the nectared bowl of friendship, or have roved the livelong summer's day in pensive thought or kindlier converse. Ah, delightful vales! o'er which the hand of partial nature sheds each wilder grace, while culture and the arts of civilized improvement spread around their gay varieties, enlivening all with social decoration. Fare ye well, for I must leave ye pleasant haunts, brakes, bournes, and populous hill and dale, and pendant woods, and you meandering streams, and you ye cots and hamlets, that with many a whitened front sprinkle the woody step and lowlier stoop, thronging gregarious round the rustic spire. Warm in the quiet glen, ah, with what joy! Scenes that I leave reluctant, with what joy have I beheld ye at the varying hour, dawn, or the noon of night, or mid the glare of Phoebus' sultry season, when your groves wooed to sequestered musings. By her side sits lowly comfort, in her decent stole, if homely yet commodious, dealing round the well-earned bread of sustenance, while shout the circling infants their sleek, ruddy cheeks, like the sun-side of brown Pomona's fruit, gladdening the kindred eye. Ah, 'tis a scene that wakes to social rapture. Not as yet towers from each peaceful dell the unwieldy pride of factory overgrown, where opulence, dispeopling the neat cottage, crowds his walls, made pestilent by congregated lungs and lewd association with a race of infant slaves broken timely to the yoke of unremitting drudgery. Little here intrudes such pompous mansions, better missed. Therefore I love Chalford, and ye vales of Stroud, irriguous, but still more I love for hospitable pleasures here enjoyed, and cordial intercourse, yet must I leave your social haunts.
And so he left these irriguous vales to wander west, where we see him sitting in the Three Cocks Inn on the road to Hay-on-Wye, composing a letter for Thomas Hardy and London Corresponding Society colleagues, then collecting whatever personal correspondence had been left untouched by Pitt spies and murderers, before making his way to Clisford, on the west bank of the River Wye, 8 miles from Brecon, in what is now Powys, but what was then the county of Breconshire, where he would create a mirror image of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's
Lime Tree Bower.
But this,
no prison.
Instead,
the political lecturer of Beaufort Buildings,
works hard.
At one end of our orchard,
Where
flows a pretty little brook, bubbling through a small romantic dingle to empty itself into the Wye, in which with hobby-horsical industry I have built a cascade, and am making a rude hermitage, a sequestered summer study in the dingle beneath.
And so, to Clisford and that celebrated occasion when Wordsworth met Thelwall for the last time. A meeting that would lead to the description of the solitary in The Excursion. A depiction of Thelwall retreating from politics and from the fervour of the French Revolution.
A narrow, winding entry opened out onto a platform enclosed between an upright mass of rock and an old moss-grown wall. A cool recess and fanciful, for where the rock and walls met at an angle hung a penthouse, framed by thrusting 2 rude staves into the wall and overlaying them with mountain sods. Impatient to pass on, when I exclaimed,
What is here? And stooping down, drew forth a book, that in the midst of stones and moss and wreck of party-coloured earthenware, aptly disposed, had lent to raise itself one of those petty structures. His it must be, exclaimed the wanderer, cannot but be his, and he is gone. The book, which in my hand had opened of itself, which was swollen with searching damp and seemingly had laid to the injurious elements exposed from week to week, I found to be a work in the French tongue, a novel of Voltaire, his famous optimist. Unhappy man, exclaimed my friend.
Some, solitary. He never forgot his earlier communal self.
I had built for myself a hermitage at Clisson, there to pursue a somewhat quieter life. I started to teach elocution and speech therapy, for I knew its necessity, having suffered with a lisp as a child. But this peace was short-lived. I was restless and returned to London with my wife, Susanna, and our children.
This wasn't some echo in Arcadia's solitary oblivion. He was back in London the next decade, in Bloomsbury, 40 Bedford Place in 1806, with his Institute for Oratory and Elocution. Then, at 57, Lincoln Inn's Fields, with the publication of Champion, and lectures, recitations, concerts, and the weekly Historical and Oratorical Society. But back to that summer of 1797 in Stroud. I wonder if he ever saw the Black Boy statue in Kendrick Street when he walked to town from Bowbridge. I know what he would have thought. For it goes without saying that John Thelwall was a committed abolitionist, an activist who also used his pen against slavery. In his Jacobin novel, The Daughter of Adoption, and in this poem from 1807, commemorating the abolition of the slave trade.
O Spirit, that rides in the whirlwind and storm, whose voice in the thunder is heard, if ever from man the poor indigent worm a prayer of affliction was heard, if black man as white is the will of thy hand, and who would create him but thee? O give thy command, let it spread through the land, let Africa's sad sons shall be free. If while in the slave ship, with many a groan, I wept o'er my sufferings in vain, while hundreds around reply to my moan, and the clanking of many a chain, if then thou but deign'st it with pitying eye, thy poor shackled creature to see, O thy mercy apply, Africa's sorrow to dry, and bid the poor slave be free. If here, as I faint in the vertical sun, and the scourge girds me on to my toil, no hope faintly soothing when labour is done, of one joy my lorn heart to beguile. If thou view'st me, Great Spirit, as one thou hast made, and my fate is dependent on thee, O impart thou thy aid, that the scourge may be stayed, and the black man at last may be free.
Here we hear 3 of the 4, sometimes 5, stanzas of that poem. The tone doesn't do justice, perhaps, to Thelwall's ability to see slavery as part of an imperial nexus. He would have noted the links between war, empire, colonies, slavery, and Stroud Scholar in his stay here with those radical clothing after his 10 days at Nether Stowey.
It would be a happy thing for the universe in general, and for Britain in particular, if there were no such thing as a colony or dependency.
Citizen John's visit to Stroud obviously had a profound impact on him. This local landscape is remembered, possibly subliminally, in his slavery novel, with the names of two of the protagonists. Remember those radical dyers and clothiers, the Partridges at Bowbridge Mill, the Newcomes at Chalford, and the Nortons at Nailsworth, on that excursion from Nether Stowey in the summer of 1797? There is a Newcomb in the novel, and a Captain Bowbridge too. But I conclude this imagined Thelwallian peripatetic at Bunhill Fields, London, burial ground of John Bunyan, Daniel Defoe, William Blake. Let us say farewell to Citizen John there in 1832 as he gives the sole eulogy at the funeral of Thomas Harding, his old London Corresponding Society colleague, with a voice that compelled 30,000 into a silent, rapt attention.
To paint the voice and fix the fleeting sound.
As the old motto for Tribune put it, a voice that struggled, as Thomson said, the world of Wordsworth and Coleridge and the world of the Spitalfields weaving. And a voice that still speaks to us today, to the gig economy world of Amazon and Deliveroo and Uber et al., where workers have little rights, are underpaid, and are scantily protected by law and trade unions. Where factories hidden in conveniently far-off lands of human rights abuses continue to employ children and put workers in danger.
Monopoly and the hideous accumulation of capital in a few hands carry in their own enormity the seeds of cure. Whatever presses men together, though it may generate some vices, is favourable to the diffusion of knowledge and ultimately promotive of human liberty. Hence, every large workshop and manufactory is a sort of political society, which no Act of Parliament can silence and no magistrate disperse.
All still true, even for those working from home. Some atomised and alienated, lacking collective support and empathy. Some facing fire and rehire and isolation, many losing a sense of mutuality, instead ploughing a lonely furrow. But just as I pursue the peripatetic from home, so as to reach out for the words of John Thelwall, so John Thelwall's words can reach out to those at home in the knowledge economy and to those at work in the gig economy. The Jacobin Fox may have been the most dangerous person in the country 200 years ago and more, but his is still a relevant voice today.
To paint the voice and fix the fleeting sound. I affirm that every man and every woman and every child ought to obtain something more in the general distribution of the fruits of their labours than food and rags and a wretched hammock with a poor rug to cover it, and that without working 12 or 14 hours a day from the ages of 6 to 60, they have a claim, a sacred and inviolable claim, to some comfort and enjoyment, to some tolerable leisure for such discussions, and some means of or such information as may lead to an understanding of their rights.
In remembrance of John Thelwall, born 27th of July, 1764, died 17th of February, 1834, aged 69.
To paint the voice and fix the fleeting sound.
Thank you.